She's always watching. My wife, Lynn, and I have been together for 6 years and married for 11 months. Our entire history together has been normal. Never once have I noticed any weird behavior or red flags. I can't stress enough how out of character everything I'm about to say is for her. Lynn is a very kind, intelligent, and thoughtful person. She's always been that no-nonsense type of person, though. Being childish, trying to scare me, is never something she'd normally do. She doesn't even like horror movies. When we started dating, she agreed to watch The Shining because she knew how much I loved horror. She was so scared that she didn't even make it halfway through the movie before we turned it off. She isn't into anything creepy, and has never been into pranks. It's just not her cup of tea, and that's fine. Which is why all of this is weird, because it's so unlike her. Almost abnormal. I should also add she's never had any mental illnesses, as far as I'm aware, and it doesn't run in her family. I should know some people are able to hide mental health problems, but in the 6 years we've been together, I should think I'd seen some sort of sign. 2 months ago, I was in the kitchen, making myself some coffee before work. I was running a bit late that morning. I knew I wouldn't be able to make it to Dunkin' Donut for my usual morning fix. I took a sip of coffee as I hurried down the hall, towards the front door, when I happened to notice Lynn peeking at me from around the corner. I could only see her eyes and a long, dark hair hanging against the wall. The rest of the body was concealed behind the corner. I nearly spilled my coffee when I saw her, just out of surprise. In the process, burned the shit out of my lip. "Geez, Lynn," I said, wiping a few drops of coffee from my pants. "Scared the shit out of me." She immediately popped out of view. Like a little kid that had been caught, I heard her scurrying off towards the living room. And by the time I got to the front door, she was already out of sight. It was really weird, and totally out of character, like I said. But I also found it kind of funny. She was being more playful, less serious. I shouted that I loved her and called her a weirdo. As I shut the door behind me, I heard her laughing. I'd almost thought that it was a good thing. Maybe she was just opening up to me or something. Her behavior was a bit odd, but certainly nothing to call a priest over. I forgot about it by lunch, and by the time I got home, she was her normal self. I didn't bring it up, and neither did she. Life went on. The next incident happened 3 days later. It was around 2 a.m. I'd woken up to get a drink. I was standing at the kitchen island, jug of OJ in hand, when I had a strong feeling that I was being watched. For whatever reason, I looked down at the floor and saw my wife's smiling face staring back at me. She was peeking at me from the other side of the island, staring with wide, unblinking eyes, grinning very similar to the Cheshire cat. I screamed, I'll admit it, not out of irritation or surprise, but fear. I was gripped by it, consumed by it. At that moment, I was scared. At the sound of my scream, she scuttled back out of view, her hands and feet smacking the tile floor as she hurried out of the kitchen on all fours. An unnerving sight. I didn't run after her or even yell. I just stood there, frozen in shock, wondering what the fuck had possessed her to do that. It took me a little longer than I'd like to admit to go back upstairs, but eventually I did. When I got to our bedroom, Lynn was laying on her side, asleep, or pretending to be. I stood there for a while, watching her breathe, to make sure she was really asleep. I had a feeling she might jump at me the moment I got in bed, but she didn't. I climbed into bed and she didn't even move. Her breathing was soft and deep, and I'd started to wonder if I'd dreamt the whole thing. Next morning, I waited for her to come down for a cup of coffee. After handing her a mug and kissing her on the cheek, I decided to ask her about it. "What was that about last night?" I asked, keeping my tone light, so I didn't offend or embarrass her. She frowned over her cup of coffee, shaking her head like she had no clue what I was talking about. "You were peeking at me again, from over there," I said, pointing to the spot on the floor by the kitchen island. She followed my gaze and looked back at me, bursted out laughing. She laughed so hard I couldn't help but join her. You creep the fuck out of me sometimes, you know that? I said. She giggled, set her cup on the counter, wrapped her arms around me. You creep me out all the time, so I guess we're even, she said. We said our goodbyes and left for work. As I drove, I kept thinking about how creepy it had been, seeing her grinning at me behind the island like that, the sounds her hand made on the floor as she crawled away. I told myself she was just trying to be silly, just trying to join me in the thing I loved most, horror. It's not like I was afraid of her, but it still didn't sit right with me. I started seeing her peeking at me more and more. Sometimes she'd be peeking from the couch or the living room curtains, or she'd even manage to get inside her grandmother's old trunk that sits at the foot of our bed. What's weird is I might not have even known she'd been there at all if the old hinges hadn't given her away. It didn't seem like she was trying to be caught. She had the lid propped up enough so only half her face peeked through. She'd been grinning like an excited toddler. It was unnerving. I didn't know what to say to her. All I could do was stare. When I finally found my voice, I asked her why on earth she was doing these things. She didn't answer. She closed the lid, shutting herself inside the trunk. I just walked away, feeling disturbed. I didn't understand why she was doing this, but clearly it made her happy. I just hoped she would tire of this game quickly. Lynn didn't peek at me for the next 2 weeks. I started to think she was done with her weird prank and was relieved. We were watching a show on Netflix one night. I jokingly said that I hadn't seen her peeking at me lately, and that she must have given up on her spy game. She looked at me with a small but disturbing smile and said, "Maybe I've just gotten better at it." I didn't say anything, but I wondered whether or not she was joking. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it and what she'd said. Was she still peeking at me when I wasn't looking and just hadn't noticed? And if so, what the hell was she getting out of this? I started to feel paranoid, consistently checking whether she was watching me from around the corner, behind a door. I was jumpy when I was home, and she wasn't in full view of me. I felt a little stupid and a little crazy. But after another few weeks, without incident, I began to relax. I stopped checking behind furniture and walls and told myself it was just a bad memory. But a few days ago, things got much worse. Lynn left to go to a friend's, and I lounged on the couch and played a couple games on my laptop. Around 9 p.m., I hopped in the shower. As I was washing the soap from my hair, I felt the awful feeling. I was again being watched. I slowly opened my eyes and had a fucking heart attack. Lynn was peeking at me behind the shower curtain. Her entire head stretched into the shower, leaving her body outside, her long dark hair against the curtain, ends dripping with water. Her mouth hung in an open and terrible grin, her eyes wide and red, as if she hadn't blinked for a while. I screamed and jumped back against the wall. She didn't move, nor did her smile waver in the slightest. Her makeup ran down her cheeks in 2 black streaks. She looked giddy, completely deranged. I was terrified. We stood like that for a few moments, neither of us saying a word. After what felt like forever, she slowly pulled her head out of the shower. I watched her blurry figure through the curtain as she moved back towards the bathroom door. A second later, the bathroom door slammed shut, hard enough to rattle the mirror. I screamed again and jumped out of the shower to lock the door and stayed in the bathroom for over an hour. Maybe I overreacted to some of you, but joke or not, I wasn't going to put up with the crazy shit anymore. That's what I kept telling myself as I paced the bathroom, stopping to listen at the door every few minutes. Suddenly I heard a muffled sound. I pressed my ear against the bathroom door, straining to listen. I couldn't hear anything, but I envisioned her standing on the other side of the door, giggling at her own joke. I felt a surge of anger. I was beyond pissed at being made to feel scared in my own home. and made to hide in a bathroom for over an hour. All for what? Some kind of joke? If it was a joke, it was an awful one. What the fuck, Lynn? I snapped. This shit is really getting annoying. I waited for her to apologize or call me a jerk, but instead I heard a faint moan. So quiet, I wondered if I'd heard it at all. Then, in complete silence, Lynn, I called out, not being able to hide the shakiness in my voice. I got no response, just my own heavy breathing. I swear to fucking God, I yelled, pounding my fist on the door. I waited for her to cuss at me, something I would expect if I talked to her like that. I never screamed at her before, but there was just nothing. Just the occasional drip from the shower head. I won't deny, I was scared. Too afraid to open the damn door and face my own fucking wife. I waited another 30 minutes, which felt like a lifetime when I was scared. Finally, I decided I wasn't going to spend my night hiding in the bathroom, so I got down on my knees and peered under the door. I almost expected to see her face peeking back at me, but thankfully I didn't. I could see straight down the hallway to the top of the stairs, but no Lynn. I didn't know if I should be happy about that or not. I looked for a few minutes, waiting to see her head pop up over the top step, but it never came. I stood up, my hands hovering over the door, and mentally prepared myself to open it. I slowly turned the lock with my shaky fingers, and was about to yank it open when I heard a little sound that makes me nauseous when I think about it. A moan, but this time I could tell just where it was coming from. I turned my head to the closet door, as if in slow motion, and locked eyes with my wife, who was peeking at me from the slightest gap. Her eyes wide as ever, her mouth hanging open in the most grotesque, gaping smile I'd ever seen. I didn't even scream. I was too scared for that. Her hands were clasped to her chest, body trembling with sheer delight, as if she could barely contain her excitement. A short, raspy moan bubbled up from her throat, deep and raw, sending shivering through my entire body. Somehow I found the ability to pull the bathroom door open and ran as fast as I could all the way down the steps, snagging my keys and phone from the table and in the living room before running out to my car. I could hear her shrill laughter behind me, but I didn't hear her getting any closer. I didn't bother shutting the front door, and I drove away from the house faster than I legally should have, shivering the entire time, either from fear or the cold, maybe a little bit of both. I hadn't even grabbed a coat or a pair of shoes. I was still in my boxers, and my hair was still damp. I drove straight to my brother Chris's house, about 40 minutes away, ignoring any and every call I got. I didn't check my phone until I was safely parked in my brother's driveway. Lynn had called 4 times, sent a flurry of texts, all wondering where I'd gone, and why I'd left like that. I threw my phone at the dash in a rage, furious at her nonchalant attitude. My brother and his wife were surprised to see me, especially dressed in a pair of boxers, but let me stay as long as I needed. I tried to sleep that night, but my brain wouldn't let me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face staring at me from inside the closet. Knowing that she'd been in there with me the entire time made my skin crawl. She never fucking left the bathroom at all. Instead, she slipped inside the closet and slammed the bathroom door shut, just to fool me. The mere thought of going home gave me anxiety. I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Chris gave me sleeping pills, so I was able to get a little rest. My sleep was filled with terrible dreams, all of Lynn's smiling face. I woke up as the sun started to rise, my body aching from the sofa, and I felt drained. I knew I'd have to call Lynn at some point, but I didn't know what to say to her. I wouldn't be going home unless she gave me her word she'd never do any more creepy shit. I just wanted my wife back. Her normal, serious self never looked so good to me. I was contemplating calling her and telling her that, when a familiar feeling overcame me. I was being watched. I was staring at the ceiling, my heart in my throat. I didn't want to look away, but the longer I ignored the feeling, the worse it got. My eyes drifted away from the ceiling almost on their own, her face pressed up against the window beside the couch, staring at me with that same gaping smile, the same deranged look, drool dribbling down her lips, leaving 2 long streaks down the glass. I didn't know how long she'd been there, but something told me she'd been there quite possibly all night. I didn't bother screaming, although I was angry, and anger triumphed any feeling I felt at the moment. I jumped up from the couch, pounding my palm against the glass. "Lynn, are you crazy? What the hell is wrong with you? Just go home," I shouted. "Now!" She didn't move. Her ghastly expression never changed. If anything, her smile only grew, as if she'd never been more elated in her life. I could hear Chris and his wife moving around the stairs, as if Lynn could hear them from her place outside. Her head twitched in their direction. She suddenly began to close her mouth slowly. Chris called my name from upstairs, obviously concerned. I turned to see him and his wife Rebecca hurrying down the stairs. When I turned back to the window, Lynn was gone. The only sign she'd been there were the 2 streaks of drool still dripping down the glass. I called out for work that day and turned my cell phone off. I didn't want to face Lynn. Just talking to her was too much for me at this point. I started to believe something was irreversibly wrong with her. No matter what promises she'd made, we'd never be the same again. The thought saddened me to my core. I cried most of the morning. By noon, I was ready to confront her, give her one last chance to explain herself. I could at least give her that. After 6 years, I told myself. I turned on my phone and saw the dozens of texts she'd said, all seemingly from a concerned wife. "Can we talk? I love you. Please call me. I'm really worried. Can you answer? Just come home." All more of the same, all texts telling me she loved me and wanted me home. How worried she was. Not a damn one addressing the crazy shit she pulled. Like she hadn't been acting like a character from a Stephen King movie. Even her texts were different. Normally she texted novels, just telling me to pick up a loaf of bread. You'd think she'd have more to say to me after some bizarre shenanigans. I know it probably seems childish to those of you who are miles away from the situation, but if you saw the way Lynn had looked at me, how she scampered on all fours like a wild animal, grinning at me inside the closet like a lunatic, then I think you'd find my reaction was warranted. I stayed with Rebecca and Chris for another night. I didn't wake up yesterday until afternoon. Thankfully, Lynn wasn't there. She stopped by this morning after Chris left for work. Beck, what did she say? Did she come inside? I asked, sweat starting to break out on my forehead. I started examining the corners as if a predator lurked behind them. No. She asked if you were awake yet, and I said you weren't. I asked if she wanted me to wake you, but she said no, just to let you sleep. She said as she washed the dishes. That's all? She said anything else? No. She looked awful, though, like she hadn't slept in days. I think you should call her. I got up from the table, thanked Beck for lunch. I sat for a while trying to figure out what to do. I didn't want to go home, but clearly I owed that to her. Eventually, my thoughts went to calling her mother. I didn't want to, believe me. Her mother and I were never on the best of terms. I'd only met her twice, both for short visits. I got the impression she didn't approve of me for her daughter. Lynn always ushered us out quick, as she didn't want me to feel uncomfortable, which at the time I was grateful for. But in retrospect, it was almost as if she didn't want me talking to her, maybe for fear I'd figure out this, but I must have been grasping at straws at that point. I was glad we moved 3 states away so we didn't have to see her as often. And now I needed her help more than anything. But everything seemed so odd, and she seemed like the answer. She answered, sounding irritated. She said, I'm in the middle of writing checks, but if you insist, I suppose I could spare a moment. What is it that you want to discuss, Benjamin? She said, coldly. Quickly, I'd asked her if there was any odd behavior that she'd noticed or mental health issues, and there was a long, uncomfortable pause. I couldn't tell, because she was just thinking, or something else. Finally, after a few seconds, she spoke. If you're truly concerned, then I suggest you get the professionals involved. I don't know what you expect of me, she snapped. I could tell she was seconds away from hanging up, and for the same reason, I was desperate not to let her. I had the feeling she knew a lot more than she was letting on. Please, if not for me, do it for Lynn, I tried. I heard a faint, shaky intake, as if she were trying to hold her steel persona together, but failing. Something shook her. I tried asking her what was wrong, but the only thing she said was, my only advice would be to seek professional help. Do not call here again. Goodbye. I tried to call her, but she'd hung up. I tried to wrap my head around the call and her refusal to help me. Even if she didn't like me, why wouldn't she help her daughter? After a while, I remembered her last words to me. Seek professional help. She said those words with urgency. I could have just been grasping at straws, but no. I was sure her voice had changed ever so slightly when she read that. As if they were very important. What had she meant? I assumed she was referring to medical professionals, but maybe she was referring to something else. Someone she didn't, for some reason, feel comfortable saying directly. She definitely knew what was going on. I waited for Chris at home, and after a long, exhausting conversation with him, I convinced him she needed medical help. Chris didn't think we should go to the police yet. He offered instead to go with me, and I readily accepted. He reasoned that calmly, trying to talk to her and coaxing her into willingly going was the best recourse, and I agreed to do it his way. At least then I wouldn't be going to the house alone. We drove over this morning, just after breakfast. There was no way I was going at night. When we pulled up, my stomach began doing somersaults. Her car still wasn't there, but I didn't let my guard down. The front door was ajar. For a split second, I thought we'd see her eyes staring through the gap. I was sweating and shaking. However, Chris, he walked toward the front door, hands in his pockets, like he was going for a fucking stroll in the park. I envied his ignorance. I pushed open the door and immediately hit with the stench of rot. Chris smelled it too. He walked up behind me, his nose scrunched up. The house was deadly quiet, and despite being 10 in the morning, all curtains closed tight, refusing any sunlight in. If I hadn't left it 2 days prior, I'd have thought the house was abandoned. We moved towards each room, carefully, checking any place she might hide, occasionally calling her name. Why the fuck are you looking under the couch? Chris said eventually. Aren't we looking for your wife? He was looking at me like I was a moron. He didn't know yet. Let's just go upstairs, I whispered. But he shook his head, but followed me up the stairs to check the bathroom and the spare bedroom. On the way up, my shoes crunched over pieces of glass that looked to be littered over the steps. I noticed one of the pictures of Lynn and my wedding portrait that hung over the wall on the steps had been smashed. The frame hung crookedly, all the glass removed. I stared at the picture, a lump formed in my throat. We'd taken that photo right after leaving church, saying our vows. I looked at Lynn's beautiful face. I never dreamed this would ever be a source of terror for me. We climbed up the steps and checked the spare bathroom, but it looked completely untouched. I hesitantly went to the bathroom, my fear from that night coming back to me all at once. Chris offered to go in by himself, but I couldn't let him do that. So we walked in together, checking the closet and the shower. The bathroom looked as it hadn't been touched since the night I left. Ben, I don't think she's here. Why don't you pack some clothes and we'll come back tomorrow or something? When I checked the closet, I came across the source of the smell. Gagged. Chris took one look and lost all color in his face. He had to go stand by the stairs to get away from the sight and smell. I gazed in shock at what lay in my bedroom closet. Soaking in a rag were at least a dozen eyeballs, carefully laid out in pairs. Some were larger as a quarter, and others were tiny as marbles. I stared down at the eyes she'd collected from small animals and wondered how she'd got them, and shuddered at the thought. "Ben, I think we should go," he called from the hall. "I'm getting nauseous." All right, I grabbed my duffel, shut the closet on my new nightmare. I stepped out in the hall, and I couldn't help but gag. I tried to tell you she needed help, but Chris only responded with, "She doesn't need help. She needs a fucking exorcist. You coming or what?" I can't stand the smell, and his words died in his throat, his eyes wide with fear. I didn't ask him why. I knew why. I could feel it. Someone was watching us the entire time, and I didn't think it was the eyes in the closet. Finally saw what we'd missed under the bed, curled on her side, watching us with excitement of a kid on Christmas morning, was my wife. She held her hands together just under her chin, and they were shaking eagerly. Now that she'd been found, I could hear the quiet noises she was making, hiccuping in her throat as if the excitement was just too much for her. It was unnerving, to say the least. Wide eyes and that same huge smile. Everything told me to run, but I tried to force it away. This was my wife. No matter how twisted, she was still the woman I married. I crouched down so I could see her better, and immediately saw the blood, her hands covered in it. They trembled more the closer I got, as if she was hardly able to contain herself. I crouched down so I could see her better, and immediately saw the blood. Her hands were covered in it. "Lynn, are you hurt? You're bleeding." She bobbed her head again, bloody fingers moving up and down as if playing an invisible piano. Occasionally, her hands grazed her chin, leaving smears of blood on her skin. I wanted to recoil in disgust. I knew she wouldn't come on her own, but I didn't want to leave her in the state she was in. I scooted over and reached out to her. The hiccuping sounds got louder, and her hands shook, fingers flexing. It was then I saw the blood oozing from between her fingers. "Oh my God, Lynn, you're bleeding." Instinctively, I snapped out to take her hand, but before I could even touch it, her hands sprang out towards me. A sharp pain went through my arm as I fell back on my ass. My arm burned. I could see blood dripping onto the carpet. I looked at her in shock, saw her madly grinning, her fingers clutching a large shard of glass. "You all right in there?" Chris asked behind me. I turned my face slightly, nodded towards him, cradling my arm to my chest. When I turned back to Lynn, I saw her focus had changed. She wasn't looking at me anymore, and she wasn't smiling either. She was staring past me, her eyes glaring at Chris, the way a hungry hunter might stare at their prey. Her mouth hanging open, but it was twisted into a snarl. I got to my feet and began walking down the hallway, afraid to take my eyes off her. I yelled at Chris, "Run, go." He must have been too afraid to move, because my back bumped into him. He was still standing on the top of the stairs, staring at the horror that was my wife. "Move your ass, Chris," I said as firmly and quietly as I could. Lynn bobbed her head in fast, sharp motions, began to grin, stretching her mouth wider and wider, so that her chin almost touched her chest. Chris muttered a prayer and then ran down the stairs. I stood at the top of the steps, stuck between a love for my wife and self-preservation. I only wanted to help, choking back tears. Her eyes focused on me again as she slowly lifted the glass, holding it in front of her. Thankfully, my body took over control, and I started fleeing down the stairs 2 or 3 steps at a time. Her mouth next to her ears, I could hear those terrible hiccuping sounds up close. I shook her off me, knocking her to the floor as she'd grabbed onto my back as I was going down. I felt a searing pain in my back as she went. I tore open the front door and bolted to my car. Chris was standing in the front yard, talking on the phone with the police. I didn't say a word. I just ran to my car and jumped in. Chris took the hint and followed me. Still on the line with 911, I watched from the rear mirror. Sure, I'd see her running after us, but I never did. I went straight to the ER, got 3 stitches in my arm and 3 in my back. The police asked a lot of questions and went back to the house to do a search, but Of course, Lynn wasn't there. They advised me to stay with a friend or a relative while they filed a restraining order. I dropped Chris off at home and went to a motel hours away. I wanted to put as much distance between me and Lynn as I could. This is where I've been for the last 4 hours. I thought maybe the police would find her. Maybe they'd get her the help she desperately needs. But now I don't think so. 40 minutes ago, I got a text from an unknown number. Just 3 words. I found you. A picture attached. The picture was dark and grainy, but I knew what it was. Instantly. There was no mistaking my wife's eye. I started typing this out immediately after. I don't know what to do. I'm alone. I'm scared. Yet for some reason, I couldn't seem to shake the feeling that I'm being watched.